"You rotten bastard. How could you do this to me? It's all your damn fault." My wife's outburst was a relentless stream of blasphemies. Occasionally, I look back and reflect on how I ended up in this uncomfortable predicament, one too familiar to many men. Years ago, like countless other fools, I found myself crammed into a subway station during rush hour. I've heard there are worse places in the world, but London is about as chaotic as I'd ever care to experience. I left Greater London a long time ago because the overcrowding became unbearable. These days, I enjoy the tranquility of the West Country, where I've made my home. Mind you, it can still get uncomfortably busy during the 6 weeks of school summer vacation. To avoid the crowds, I typically steer clear of my town during that time. But on this particular day, I had to visit the head office of my employer, a trip I normally avoid like the plague. Fate, however, had other plans. Ever since I assumed the role of manager at our small factory, productivity has soared to record-breaking levels. This achievement, however, didn't stem from constant monitoring. Unlike my predecessor, I let people focus on the work they excelled at without pestering them for updates every 5 minutes. Of course, the pen pushers at headquarters failed to grasp this. If they had any clue about how we actually handled all their incessant memos, they probably would have fired me. As I pushed my way toward the front of the platform, something drew my attention to my right. Perhaps it was a reflex, a quick glance to check for an oncoming train. But in that moment, I caught sight of a face in the distance, and my heart seemed to skip a beat. Standing there, far away but unmistakable, was Sandy. At least I was almost certain it was her. A decade had passed since I'd last seen her. I tried to move closer, to head in her direction, but just then, a train pulled into the station, cutting off any chance I had to close the gap. I thought I saw Sandy board the carriage next to mine, but with the crush of passengers, there was no hope of reaching it. Instead, I squeezed through the nearest door just before it shut. Packed tightly among the other commuters, I could only hope she was somewhere on board. Sandy and I first met in elementary school, where even then, she was the prettiest girl in the class, or at least that's what I thought. Perhaps it was nothing more than a schoolboy crush. She went by Sandra back then, and she was the first girl I truly got to know. My older brothers had a habit of teasing the local girls mercilessly, and as their sibling, I was unfairly lumped into the same category. Despite this, Sandra and I became close, though never on the playground, of course. Any boy who dared play with a girl during recess risked being labeled a wimp. In the classroom, however, it was a different story. Sandra and I always ended up sitting together, helping each other with assignments. We were regularly chosen as class monitors, entrusted with tasks ranging from handing out milk to managing sports equipment. For 5 years through elementary and junior high, we spent most school days together and always walked home side by side, much to the annoyance of my brothers. But everything changed in year 11. That summer, as we prepared to move up to middle school, Sandra's family relocated. It wasn't far, but it was enough to land her in a different school district. After that, we lost touch. 6 years passed before I saw her again. It was a Wednesday night, though I could confirm the exact date if I checked. The Pinner Fair, an annual one-day event dating back to a royal decree centuries ago, was in full swing. Many towns across England host similar fairs, but the Pinner Fair is a must-see. The high street is transformed overnight, packed with attractions like a Ferris wheel, a wall of death, and a merry-go-round. By the following morning, it all disappears as if it were never there. That evening, I persuaded a girl, whose name escapes me now, to accompany me to the fair. In hindsight, I should have gone with my brothers, but at 17, I was ruled by my hormones. Standing beside the Wurlitzer with my date on my arm, I waited for the ride to start. As it did, I was suddenly struck by a familiar face floating into view. My heart recognized her immediately. Sandra. At that moment, I wished I were alone. My date, noticing my reaction, spun her head around in search of the source of my distraction. What she thought about my behavior, I'll never know, but the mood between us took a sharp downturn. When the ride slowed, I saw Sandra again. As my date and I disembarked, Sandra and her friends were climbing aboard. Much to my companion's irritation, I insisted we wait for the ride to finish so I could speak to her. When Sandra finally stepped off, I mustered a casual hi, pretending there was nothing more than old friendship between us. But it was a poor act, and I doubt we fooled anyone. My date, unimpressed, asked me how long I'd been in love with Sandy. "She's just an old friend from grade school," I said. Her response was scathing. "Yeah, and I'm Brenda Lee." The rest of the evening was a disaster. We searched the fairgrounds but couldn't find Sandra or her friends again. Unsurprisingly, it was the last date I ever had with that girl. Yet I owe her a debt of gratitude, for it was she who pointed out what I had been too blind to see. I was still in love with Sandy. For the next couple of years, Sandy remained a bittersweet memory, one I tried not to dwell on too much. My initial, frantic attempts to find her had failed. Tracking someone in a city of 6 million people isn't easy, especially without the resources I'd have now. Through the phone book, I eventually located her father, but he was difficult to talk to. I learned his wife had left him for another man, taking Sandy with her. Piece by piece, I gathered information. Sandy had grown tired of her mother's behavior and left home. Her stepfather had moved on, and her mother, likely struggling with alcohol, was no help when I called. And so Sandy became a ghost of my past, a lingering question without an answer. When I returned to the house a few weeks later, hoping Sandy's mother might be sober enough to tell me where I could find her, I was met with an empty home. The furniture was gone, and a "for rent" sign hung outside. The landlord informed me they had evicted Sandy's mother for failing to pay rent. All further attempts to locate Sandy after that were fruitless. One evening, while at a pub not far from my home, I saw Sandy's face again. This time, she was on the dance floor in another man's arms, and they looked entirely smitten with each other. He was all over her, and I burned with jealousy. A couple of times I tried standing where she might notice me, but if she saw me, she gave no indication of it. I had changed a lot by then, what some politely referred to as being a hippie. For those old enough to remember, it was the era of long hair, ridiculously colorful clothing, and beads, so many beads. Thinking back on it now, I cringe at the image of myself. After a while, I noticed Sandy leaving the pub with another guy. Slipping away from my friends, I followed her outside. By the time I got there, neither Sandy nor the man was in sight. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed movement in a parked car. I'm no voyeur, but my curiosity got the better of me. I wandered aimlessly through the lot, edging closer to the car. In the dim light, I could just make out the guy sitting in the front seat, clearly enjoying the view of Sandy in the back. I should have been devastated by what I saw, but this was the 60s, an era of free love and all that. There was no official connection between Sandy and me beyond our high school friendship, so all I could do was simmer in jealousy. Despite the emotional blow, I left the pub and headed straight home. A stupid move in hindsight. It would have been far better to stay by the door and wait for her to see me when she came back inside. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. It would be another year or so before I saw Sandy again, this time at a wedding where I was the best man. The reception had moved to the bride's father's house by late evening, and I was feeling no pain, if you catch my drift. I had spent most of the day preoccupied with 2 stunning bridesmaids, and my efforts had finally paid off. Somehow, I managed to get both of them into bed. A first for me. I doubted they would even remember it in the morning, and truthfully, I might not have remembered much of it myself if Sandy hadn't walked into the room to grab her coat. I don't know what went through her mind when she saw one girl riding me like a cowgirl while the other sat on my face. Still, Sandy recognized me immediately. "Hey Dave," she said coolly. "Stay out of my way." She grabbed her coat and left. It took me a few moments to register her voice, but when I did, I scrambled to act. The girl on my face was sent flying as I leapt to my feet, and I'm not sure what happened to the other one. I dashed after Sandy without stopping to grab a shirt or shoes. Unfortunately, one of the bridesmaids' parents was also at the party, and things got awkward quickly. So I left, heading home alone once more. Our next encounter was fleeting. It happened at my own wedding. As I stood outside the church, posing for the obligatory photographs with my new bride, I spotted Sandy in the crowd of onlookers. What could I do? I couldn't exactly abandon my wife for 5 minutes to talk to an old flame. Somehow, I think that wouldn't have gone over well. Looking back, it was probably the best decision I made that day. This was still the era of free love, but my wife didn't seem to understand the difference between being single and being married. Let's just say I quickly discovered she had trouble staying faithful. Within a year, the guy who had been my best man was in the hospital, and I was left on my own, with a criminal record for bodily harm, no less. In case you're curious, yes, they had been fooling around at the reception. But their affair started earlier, during her hen party. A friend of my ex-wife's was kind enough to share this information, while we were in bed together, ironically enough. After the divorce, I didn't exactly wallow in self-pity. I made my way through as many of my ex-wife's friends as I could, nearly completing the set. One silver lining was the paternity test during her pregnancy, which revealed there was no way I could be the father, wrong blood type. There were no DNA tests back then, but the proof was damning enough. Back to that subway ride, Sandy was in the next car. At every station I craned my neck to see if she would get off, but she didn't, or at least I never saw her do so. When the crowd thinned out, I moved to the car where I thought she'd been, but she was gone. Deflated, I changed trains and returned to my hotel. That night, I abandoned my plans to visit my parents and sat in my room, getting drunk instead. Drinking doesn't solve anything, but it numbs the pain, for a while at least. The next day, I had an idea. In big cities, people tend to stick to routines during rush hour, traveling at the same time each day. So at 4 p.m., I stationed myself near the escalator where I'd seen Sandy the previous day. Scanning the crowd with binoculars, I scrutinized every face. My patience was rewarded when I spotted her descending the escalator. She stood to the right, steadying herself on the handrail, her purse held in her left hand. There was no wedding ring. When Sandy reached the bottom, she noticed me. Confusion flashed across her face before it melted into a smile. Without a word, she stepped off the escalator and straight into my arms. And now here I am, holding Sandy's hand as she screams profanities at me. This is the third time we've been through this. Sandy always insists it's my fault, but she's been a willing participant every time. I don't mind her yelling. I've been told childbirth is excruciating. I'm just relieved it's not me in that position. I suggested a C-section this time, but Sandy refused. She didn't want a scar to ruin her bikini body. Even now, she's the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Life goes on.